These notes are for Module K, Unit 1, Lesson 2. You can find these notes in your Module K notes if you click on the Lesson 2 link noted here. There are 4 learning targets for this lesson. I know the difference between a dependent and an independent variable. I can list the steps of the scientific method in order. I can tell whether a source of information is reliable or not. And I can summarize the 4 types of scientific investigations. There are 6 vocab words for this lesson. You can look these definitions up in the glossary found on Think Central. Make sure you've got completed definitions before the open note quiz. There are 4 types of scientific investigations. In class, we've primarily focused on experiments. An experiment is an organized procedure to study something under controlled conditions. That means an experiment usually takes place in a lab because in that setting, the researcher can control everything about the environment. The temperature, the amount of water or rainfall, the amount of sunlight, all of those conditions can be controlled so they know that their results are only because of the variable that they are adjusting. Sometimes, though, a researcher doesn't want a controlled experiment. They want to see how something would behave in its natural environment. In that case, they do something called an observational study. An observational study takes place in the subject's natural setting. It's outside of a lab. It's important to keep careful records. So if I wanted to study 6th graders, I might do an observational study in the hallway or the cafeteria. If I wanted to study giraffes, I might do an observational study on the African Sahara. A model represents something that is too big, too small, or too inconvenient to work with. A model is useful because there are things that simply aren't feasible to study in person. For example, if we wanted to study the solar system, it would be awesome to see how all of the planets orbit around the sun, but we simply can't take a field trip and go to space. So instead we use a model with smaller versions of the actual planets. Or if I wanted to learn to be a heart surgeon, it would be important for me to practice on something other than a human being that's still alive and needs that heart for survival. The downside to a model is that it doesn't give you all of the information. With that heart surgery example, I can practice on things like a plastic model that's realistic, or a computer simulation, or even a pig heart, but I will never get the experience or the stress of operating on a heart that someone needs to live until I operate on the actual real thing. The 4th type of scientific investigation is a survey. Surveys include questions that are asked of a representative group, and the researcher looks for patterns or trends. That representative group is important. If you are going to survey 6th graders to find out the most popular NFL team in the 6th grade class, and you only surveyed 20 girls, you wouldn't get representative information because the 6th grade class is made up of almost equal numbers of boys and girls, and your survey only included girls. With political surveys, it's important to include the entire group. For example, with the current presidential election that's on the horizon, it would be important to survey people from both political parties, to survey men and women, survey all of the age groups, and to survey people from around the country in order to get a truly representative picture of the U.S. population as a whole. There are 7 steps to the scientific method. Step 1 is state the problem. Step 2, gather information and observe. Step 3 is form a hypothesis. Step 4 is to design the experiment. Step 5 is to conduct the experiment and gather data. Step 6 is to analyze the data. And step 7 is to state the conclusion and share your results. These steps are not necessarily completed in that order every time, and scientists often go back and repeat steps along the way. When we talk about the scientific methods, there's some experiment vocabulary we need to include. In an experiment, the control is the group you do not experiment on. This group helps you determine if you would have gotten those same results anyway, even without the variable you were adjusting. For example, if I wanted to study the impact of classical music on plant growth, I would need a group of plants that wasn't exposed to music at all, so that I see how much they would grow in my 3-week period without any classical music. That way I can see whether the plants that were exposed to classical music actually grew more or less than they usually would have. In an experiment, the dependent variable is the variable that changes as a result of your experiment. So this is what you measure in that plant experiment. The amount the plants grow in 3 weeks is the dependent variable, and I measure their growth each day. The independent variable is the variable the researcher controls. That is what drives the experiment. So again, in the plant example, the independent variable would be the amount of classical music I play for my plants. Everything else in the experiment is called a constant. Those are things that stay the same. All of the plants in that experiment should get the same amount of sunlight, the same amount of water. They should all be the same type of plant. They should be in the same soil, the same pot. All of those factors should stay the same, and the only thing that changes is one independent variable, the classical music. When that's the case, we call it a controlled experiment. All experiments should be repeated by the original researcher multiple times, and once they have continued to get the same results over and over, their experiment should be replicated by other scientists. So repetition means the original researcher redoing their own experiment to see if they get the same results over and over. Replication means doing someone else's experiment in your own lab to see if you get the same results that they did. It's possible that that original researcher got the same results over and over because they made the same mistake over and over, or perhaps those results only occur in that particular setting. Then when we talk about scientific information that we might use as part of our research for an experiment or an investigation, there are some questions we need to ask because, as you know, there's a lot of information on the internet and not all of it is accurate. When you're looking for information related to a science topic, you should ask yourself, is this a reliable source, like a scientific journal or some sort of hospital or university research? You should also ask if the source of information gives references. Do they tell where they got their information, and are those trustworthy sources? And lastly, is this information fact or opinion? If it's opinion, it certainly shouldn't be used as a basis for a scientific investigation. Wikipedia is never a good source of information for these topics because anyone can contribute to that website.